On December 24th, while most families were wrapping last-minute gifts, a single father was handed an eviction notice. His 6-year-old daughter clung to his leg in the falling snow. But this landlord had no idea who the father's old army buddy was or the blizzard of consequences about to hit by morning. This is Alex Miller, an army veteran turned construction worker, and his daughter Chloe. Their landlord, Richard Vance, owned over 24 properties and had a reputation for ruthless efficiency. But on that Christmas Eve, he picked the wrong tenant to bully, because Alex had one phone call to make, and it would turn a private eviction into a very public reckoning. To understand why that phone call was a nuclear option, you need to know about Richard Vance's empire. He owned 27 rental units across the city, all acquired through foreclosure auctions during the 2008 housing crisis. Over the next decade, he'd become notorious in tenant advocacy circles for what they called the December squeeze, pushing out long-term tenants right before the holidays to bypass rent control laws and hike prices for the new year. Alex Miller had been living in Unit 4B at 214 Maple Avenue for 5 years. It was a modest 2-bedroom with drafty windows, but it was home. He'd moved in after his wife, Sarah, passed away from cancer when Chloe was just a baby. The army had taught him logistics, and construction taught him endurance, both skills he needed as a single dad working 60-hour weeks to keep the rent paid and food on the table. The trouble started in early November. The building's ancient boiler gave out, leaving all 12 units without heat for 8 days. Temperatures dropped into the 20s. Tenants submitted complaints, but Vance's property management company, Castle Holdings, sent a single-space heater per apartment and a note saying temporary solution. By city code, landlords have 72 hours to restore essential heat. Vance ignored the deadline. Here's where the legal chess game began. Under the city's repair and deduct statute, tenants can withhold rent if essential repairs aren't made within a reasonable time. Alex, acting as the building's informal spokesperson, organized the tenants. They collectively placed their November rent into an escrow account, sending Vance a certified letter explaining the money would be released when the heat was restored. It was a textbook tenant rights move, perfectly legal, and it infuriated Vance. On November 15th, the first eviction notice appeared on Alex's door. It cited non-payment of rent and gave him 10 days to pay in full or vacate, but Alex had the escrow paperwork, the certified letter receipt, and photos of the broken boiler. He filed a counterclaim with the housing court, triggering an automatic 30-day stay on any eviction proceedings. For a moment, it seemed like the system was working. But Vance had a different playbook. While the court case was pending, he began what housing lawyers call a constructive eviction campaign. On December 1st, maintenance crews accidentally shut off the building's hot water for 3 days. On December 10th, the building's front door lock was changed without distributing new keys, leaving several elderly tenants locked out in the cold. Each incident was followed by a terse email from Castle Holdings apologizing for the unfortunate oversight. By mid-December, 3 families had broken down and paid their withheld rent just to make the harassment stop. 2 more families, fearing an actual eviction on their record, found new places and moved out. Vance was winning through attrition, but Alex and 4 other holdouts stayed put, their escrow accounts still full, their court date set for January 10th. Then, on December 22nd, the weather turned. A blizzard warning was issued for Christmas Eve. That's when Vance made his move. At 9 a.m. on December 23rd, Alex received a phone call from a lawyer representing Castle Holdings. The message was blunt. The escrow arrangement was invalid because it wasn't authorized by a judge, and Alex now owed 2 months' rent, November and December, immediately. If he didn't vacate by noon on December 24th, the sheriff would be called to execute a lockout for non-payment. This was the crucial deception. A lockout is an illegal self-help eviction, a landlord changing the locks without a court order. But Vance was betting Alex, a construction worker without a lawyer, wouldn't know the difference. The threat of the sheriff was a bluff, but a terrifying one. Alex spent the 23rd calling legal aid. Every office was closed for the holidays. The tenant union's hotline went to voicemail. He had less than 24 hours, a 6-year-old daughter expecting Santa, and a blizzard coming. That night, as he wrapped the last of Chloe's presents, a second-hand bike he'd spent 3 weekends refurbishing, he looked at a framed photo on his dresser. It showed two young soldiers in Afghanistan, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning like idiots. Him and Michael Torres, who was now Mayor Michael Torres. They hadn't spoken in over a year, life getting in the way, but the inscription on the back of the photo read, "Brothers forever, you ever need anything you call." It felt like crossing a line, like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. But as he listened to the wind howl outside and looked at Chloe sleeping peacefully, the nut was his entire life. On the morning of the 24th, with snow already falling, Alex made two calls. The first was to Richard Vance's office. He asked one last time for an extension until after the holidays, promising the full rent from escrow. Vance's response, captured later in a deposition, was, "The time for talking is over. Be out by noon or your stuff will be on the curb." The second call was to a private cell phone number. When the mayor answered, Alex simply said, "Mike, it's Alex Miller. I'm in trouble and I have nowhere else to go." What happened next wasn't a conversation between friends. It was a mayor activating a crisis protocol. Within 10 minutes of that call, 3 unmarked city vehicles were en route to 214 Maple Avenue. But they weren't coming to help Alex move out. They were coming to document what one city attorney would later call a textbook case of predatory constructive eviction. The first to arrive was Lara Chen, the city's deputy commissioner of housing preservation. She stepped out into the swirling snow just as Richard Vance's property manager arrived to supervise the lockout. Chen, holding an official tablet, didn't acknowledge him. She walked straight to the broken boiler in the basement, took photos, and noted the date on a work order that had been marked completed 2 weeks prior. Then she moved to the utility closets, the fire escapes, the common areas. Every violation was logged with GPS coordinates and time stamps. Meanwhile, at City Hall, Mayor Torres was doing two things simultaneously. First, he called the city's corporation council, directing an emergency injunction be filed in housing court to halt any eviction proceedings at 214 Maple due to documented bad faith and retaliatory action. Second, and more critically, he asked a simple question to his chief of staff. How many other properties does Castle Holdings own in this city, and what's their violation history? The answer, pulled from city databases in under an hour, was staggering. Of Vance's 27 properties, 22 had open, unresolved housing code violations. These weren't minor issues. At a building on Elm Street, tenants had been without a functioning stove for 6 months. At another on Oak Boulevard, raw sewage had been backing into a basement apartment for 3 weeks. The total number of outstanding violations across his portfolio was 189. But here's where the story pivots from one family's crisis to a systemic breakdown. The city's own enforcement system had failed. Each of those 189 violations had been inspected, documented, and filed. Fines had been levied, totaling over $47,000, but Vance's company had simply ignored them. He'd paid less than $5,000. The system was designed to penalize landlords, but it had no teeth to force compliance when a landlord decided the fines were just a cost of doing business. At noon on Christmas Eve, as the blizzard intensified, Richard Vance arrived at the Maple Avenue building personally. He found Alex and Chloe on the front steps, their boxes beside them, but he also found Lara Chen and 2 housing inspectors blocking the doorway. Vance, confident and smug, waved his eviction notice. "This is a legal matter," he said. "You have no authority here." Chen's response was calm. "Mr. Vance, under Section 502 of the City Housing Code, I have the authority to declare any dwelling unit with imminent life safety hazards unfit for human habitation. As of 60 seconds ago, this entire building is under an emergency vacate order." She handed him a printed notice. "No one is being evicted. Everyone is being relocated at city expense until repairs are made, including Mr. Miller." Vance's face went pale. An emergency vacate order meant the city could place all 12 families in hotels at his expense. It also triggered an automatic full-code inspection of every unit in the building within 48 hours. But the real blow came next. Chen's tablet chimed. She read the update, then looked at Vance. The city's corporation council has just filed for the appointment of a 7A administrator for this property. This was the nuclear option. A 7A administrator is a court-appointed receiver who takes over control of a building from a negligent landlord. All rent collected goes to repairs, not the owner's pocket. For Vance, it meant losing control and cash flow from the building indefinitely. Vance spluttered, threatening to call his lawyer, threatening to sue the city for harassment. But as he was ranting, his phone rang. It was the mayor's office, requesting his presence at a meeting at City Hall at 2 p.m. Christmas Eve. The message was clear: the game had changed, and he was now playing against the house. While Vance was driving downtown through the snow, Alex and Chloe were being escorted to a warm city vehicle. They weren't taken to a shelter. They were taken to a suite at the downtown Marriott, booked and paid for by the city's emergency housing fund. For Chloe, it was an adventure, a hotel with a pool and room service. For Alex, it was the first moment in 2 months he could breathe without the weight of impending homelessness crushing his chest. At 2 p.m., in a stark conference room at City Hall, Richard Vance sat across from Mayor Michael Torres. The mayor didn't mention Alex. He didn't mention their friendship. He laid out a spreadsheet showing the 189 open violations across Vance's portfolio. Then he played a recording, obtained from the city's 311 call center, of an elderly tenant from the Elm Street building sobbing as she reported her stove had been broken for months and she couldn't cook her meals. "Your business model," the mayor said, his voice even, "appears to be based on exploiting the fact that the people you rent to don't have the resources to fight you. That ends today." Vance, ever the negotiator, tried to cut a deal. He'd fix the boiler on Maple Avenue immediately. He'd drop the eviction proceedings against Alex. The mayor listened, then slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a proposed consent decree. In exchange for the city not pursuing immediate 7A receivership on all 27 properties, Vance would agree to a full, independent inspection of every single unit he owned within the next 7 days. He would correct every violation found within 30 days, and he would place $500,000 in an escrow account to guarantee the work would be completed. Vance refused. He called it a shakedown. He stood up to leave, saying he'd see the city in court. That's when the mayor said the words that would change everything. "Before you go, Mr. Vance, you should know the district attorney's office has opened an investigation into Castle Holdings for potential wire fraud. It seems your company has been submitting forged repair invoices to the housing court for years." This was the major pivot. The city hadn't just been looking at code violations. They'd subpoenaed Vance's bank records, his contractor invoices, his court filings, and they'd found a pattern. Vance would submit receipts from a shell company called Quality Building Solutions for repairs that were never done. He used these forged documents to get eviction judgments against tenants who withheld rent for legitimate repairs. It wasn't just negligence, it was systematic fraud. Vance sat back down. The bluster was gone. The meeting lasted another hour. When Vance left City Hall, he was no longer a powerful property owner. He was a man facing the possible seizure of his entire portfolio and criminal charges. But as he drove away, he made one call to his lawyer. And that call set in motion a counterattack no one saw coming. Because Richard Vance had one powerful card left to play. He wasn't just a landlord. He was a significant donor to the city's political machine. Over the past decade, he'd contributed over $120,000 to various city council campaigns, including the campaign of Councilman David Greer, the chairman of the powerful Housing and Development Committee. And Councilman Greer had just received a frantic phone call. Councilman David Greer didn't call the mayor, he called the press. By 8 p.m. on Christmas Eve, a local news station was running a breaking story with the headline, "Mayor uses emergency powers to help Army buddy, leaves other families in cold." The narrative was perfect. A mayor abusing his office for personal favors while ignoring systemic problems. But the story they were about to uncover was far bigger than one friendship. The morning of December 26th, City Hall was in chaos. Reporters camped in the lobby, demanding comment. Conservative talk radio hosts painted Mayor Torres as a corrupt machine politician, but the mayor's team had anticipated the backlash. At 10 a.m., they held a press conference and released every single document: the 189 open violations, the forged invoices, the 311 call logs from Vance's other properties. They didn't just defend their actions, they declared war on the entire system that allowed Vance to operate. The mayor stood at the podium and said, "This isn't about one tenant. It's about 127 tenants across 27 buildings who have been living in squalor while their landlord submitted fake paperwork to our courts. If helping one veteran I served with exposes that, then I'm guilty as charged. The data dump was a masterstroke. It shifted the conversation from Mayor helps friend to why did the city allow this to happen? Reporters now had a treasure trove of leads, and they followed them. By December 28th, a tenant from Vance's Oak Boulevard building came forward with a story that changed everything. Her name was Maria Flores, a 72-year-old grandmother. She testified that in November, her ceiling had caved in from a water leak. She'd called Castle Holdings daily for 2 weeks. Finally, a maintenance man came, looked at the damage, and said, "Lady, this whole place is falling apart. You should just leave." When she refused, her apartment was mysteriously burglarized 3 days later. Her television and her late husband's watch were stolen, but nothing else was taken. She believed it was a warning. Her story sparked a deluge. Over the next 48 hours, the city's tenant hotline received over 300 calls from renters in other buildings owned by different landlords, reporting similar patterns of harassment, neglect, and forged repair records. The Vance case wasn't an outlier, it was a template. Here where the investigation hit its most shocking revelation. Reporters cross-referencing the city's housing violation database made a staggering discovery. The top 10 worst offending landlords in the city, including Vance, were all using the same handful of shell companies for repairs. One company, Metro Building Solutions, had billed over $2 million in repair work across the city in the past 3 years. But a check of state business records showed its listed address was a UPS store mailbox, and its licensed contractor was a 78-year-old man in Florida who'd been retired for a decade. The entire system of repair certification was a fraud. On January 2nd, the district attorney held her own press conference. She announced a grand jury investigation into what she termed a criminal conspiracy to defraud tenants and the housing court. She named Richard Vance and 3 other major landlords as targets, but then she dropped the real bombshell. We are also investigating allegations of bribery and corruption within the city's Department of Buildings, where certain inspectors may have been paid to overlook critical violations. The scandal was no longer about a landlord. It was about the city itself. Councilman Greer, who had launched the initial attack, went suddenly silent because public records showed that one of the other landlords under investigation, a man named Carl Russo, was Greer's second-largest campaign donor. Pressure mounted on the mayor from all sides. The Landlords Association threatened a lawsuit for targeted harassment. The city council was divided, with some members calling for an independent investigation into the mayor's conduct. But then, on January 4th, the tenants struck back. A coalition of tenant unions from across the city organized a rally outside City Hall. Over 500 people showed up in the freezing cold, holding signs that read, "Housing is a human right," and "Enforce the code." They brought with them a petition signed by over 10,000 residents demanding a tenant bill of rights and the creation of a special prosecutorial unit for housing crimes. At that rally, Alex Miller stepped up to the microphone. He hadn't spoken publicly until that moment. "I called my friend because I was scared for my little girl," he told the crowd. "But what I've learned is that my story isn't special. It's happening every day to people who don't have a mayor's number in their phone. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed for them. We need to redesign it for us." His speech went viral. The public sentiment shifted overwhelmingly in favor of the mayor's crackdown. Donations to the tenant unions tripled overnight. Facing public fury and a widening criminal probe, Richard Vance's lawyer contacted the district attorney on January 6th with an offer. Vance would cooperate fully with the investigation, providing documents and testimony against other landlords and corrupt officials, in exchange for immunity from the most serious fraud charges. He would still lose his properties and face fines, but he would avoid prison. The DA took the deal, and what Vance handed over was a ledger, not a digital file, but an old-fashioned, leather-bound book. In it, he had recorded over a decade of consulting fees and campaign donations paid to city inspectors, housing court clerks, and 3 sitting city council members. One of those names was Councilman David Greer. On the morning of January 8th, FBI agents arrested Councilman Greer at his home. They also arrested 2 senior building inspectors and the chief clerk of the housing court. The charge: conspiracy to commit honest services fraud. The city was in shock. But for Mayor Torres, the victory was bitter. The scandal revealed a rot that went to the core of the city's housing enforcement. He stood in his office, looking at a map of the city dotted with hundreds of properties owned by the now indicted landlords. Fixing one building for his friend was easy. Fixing a broken system for an entire city seemed impossible. He called a meeting with his senior staff and said one sentence that would define the next chapter: "We don't just prosecute the bad actors, we rebuild the system so this can't happen again." And with that, he set in motion a plan that would either be his greatest legacy or his political ruin. Rebuilding the system began with a wrecking ball. In the first quarter of the new year, the city filed for 7 administrative receivership on all 27 of Richard Vance's properties. A non-profit housing organization was appointed to manage them, using the rent money to fund long-delayed repairs. Tenants, for the first time in years, had heat that worked and walls without mold. Richard Vance pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud, perjury, and bribery. In exchange for his full cooperation, which led to the convictions of 2 other landlords and 4 city employees, he avoided prison. His sentence was 5 years of probation, a lifetime ban from owning rental property in the city, and the forfeiture of his entire portfolio. The buildings were sold at auction, with the proceeds going into a city fund for tenant relocation and emergency repairs. Vance moved to another state. The empire was gone. For Alex and Chloe, the hotel stay lasted 3 weeks. In that time, the city completed emergency repairs on their apartment at 214 Maple Avenue, a new boiler, sealed windows, repaired plumbing. They moved back home in late January. Alex's escrowed rent was returned to him, but the victory was bigger than one apartment. Using the political capital from the scandal, Mayor Torres pushed a sweeping legislative package through the city council. It was called the Tenant First Act. Its provisions were revolutionary for the city. It created a housing code enforcement strike force with subpoena power and dedicated prosecutors. It established a citywide right to counsel program guaranteeing free legal representation to any tenant facing eviction. Most importantly, it implemented a certificate of no harassment requirement. Before any building could be sold or refinanced, the city had to certify that the owner had no history of illegal eviction tactics. Without that certificate, you couldn't get a loan or a permit. It made predatory behavior bad for business. The impact was immediate and measurable. In the first year after the law passed, the number of constructive eviction complaints filed with the city dropped by 60%. The number of tenants represented by lawyers in housing court jumped from 15% to over 70%. Eviction filings citywide fell by nearly a third. But the story doesn't end with statistics. It ends with people. Maria Flores, the grandmother from Oak Boulevard, saw her ceiling properly repaired. She now leads a tenant association in her building. The other holdouts from Maple Avenue became volunteer tenant advocates, helping others navigate the system they had to fight. Alex Miller didn't go back to being just a construction worker. He was appointed by the mayor to serve on the city's new Housing Stability Board, a tenant majority panel that oversees enforcement of the new laws. He uses his first-hand experience to shape policy, ensuring the system has a human face. Chloe, now in 2nd grade, tells her classmates her dad helps keep people in their homes. Here is the final, surprising detail that few people know. That second-hand bike Alex refurbished for Chloe for Christmas, it was stolen from their storage unit during the chaos of the eviction. When the story of the Christmas Eve showdown went national, a toy company CEO saw the news. He tracked down Alex's story, found out about the bike, and sent a team to their apartment building on New Year's Day. They presented Chloe with a new bike, but they also presented every child in the 12-unit building with a new bicycle. For the CEO, it was a publicity stunt. For the kids, it was magic. For Alex, it was a sign that sometimes justice has unexpected side effects. The mayor's political gamble paid off. He was re-elected in a landslide the following year, with housing justice as the centerpiece of his platform. His friendship with Alex, once scrutinized as a scandal, is now cited as an example of how personal connection can spark systemic change. As the new systems bedded in, a copy of the city's Tenant First Act was downloaded over 10,000 times by housing advocates in other cities across the country. What started as a desperate phone call on a snowy Christmas Eve became a blueprint for municipal reform. The blizzard of consequences Richard Vance feared wasn't just about fines or lost properties. It was about an entire city deciding that the era of impunity for slumlords was over. The repairs at 214 Maple Avenue were finished by spring. The tenants held a block party to celebrate. Mayors showed up not for a photo op, but for a piece of Maria Flores's famous tamales. Alex and the mayor stood on the front steps, the same steps where Alex had sat with his boxes just a few months earlier. No cameras were rolling. It was just two old friends, a building full of families who were home, and a system that finally worked. The story of Alex Miller and Richard Vance is more than a feel-good holiday tale. It's a case study in how power actually works and how it can be redirected. For decades, the imbalance between tenants and landlords wasn't just about money. It was about information, access, and the presumption that the system would always favor the one with the most resources. What changed in this city wasn't the laws on the books. Those existed. What changed was enforcement and accountability. The Tenant First Act didn't create new rights so much as it created new pathways to existing ones. It gave teeth to regulations that were already there. And that's the critical lesson. Often, the tools for justice already exist. They're just buried under bureaucracy, underfunded, or intentionally ignored. This story forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. How many other Richard Vances are operating in our cities right now? The data suggests the answer is many. Across America, an estimated 2.7 million evictions were filed last year. In some cities, eviction filing rates have soared to over 50% above pre-pandemic levels. And behind every filing is a family, a story, a cascade of consequences that can last for generations. Children in evicted families are significantly more likely to experience homelessness, to repeat a grade, to suffer long-term health and developmental setbacks. The Christmas Eve showdown revealed something else, the power of a single story to crack open a systemic issue. But one story isn't enough. It takes the Maria Floreses coming forward, the tenant unions organizing, the journalists connecting the dots, and yes, the public officials willing to use their power not for patronage, but for protection. This is not a story with a perfectly happy ending. The new housing laws face constant legal challenges from real estate lobbies. Affordable housing is still scarce. The economic pressures that create slumlords, the hunger for maximum profit with minimum investment, haven't disappeared. But what has changed is the cost of doing business that way. The risk calculus shifted, and that shift was born from a combination of personal courage, political will, and public outrage. So the next time you walk past an apartment building in your neighborhood, consider the invisible infrastructure that determines whether the people inside are safe or scared. Consider the codes unwritten and the codes unenforced. And remember that the distance between a freezing doorstep and a warm home isn't just measured in degrees. It's measured in accountability. If you want to see more stories that dissect how power moves in the real world, hit that subscribe button. We break down one complex human story every week. And if this story made you think of someone or someplace, share it. Because sometimes change doesn't start with a protest. It starts with a conversation. Thanks for watching.